and welcome back to the channel. I am your host Muriel, and in this video I will be doing a review of Borne, written by Jeff Vandermeer. Borne is a standalone weird science fiction novel I first read in 2018, and which I reread, well, I guess 2 months ago now. As a reminder and for context, I consider Jeff Vandermeer a favorite author, which is pretty rare for me, and his Southern Reach trilogy remains to this day my favorite science fiction series of all time. Borne never reached that high for me, but I loved it in 2018 and just knew I'd have to reread it in the future. And I'm really glad I did so in January because I loved it as much as, if not more, than the first time I read it. Yay! Borne is set in a ruined, nameless city of the undetermined future and centers on a woman named Rachel, who makes her living, if you can call it that, as a scavenger and shares her life and home with Wick, a bioengineer who provides for the both of them by selling drugs and various bits of repurposed biotech. One day, at the start of the novel, Rachel finds a strange creature which kind of looks like a big green lump at first. I always kind of picture something like Flubber, and that she names Borne, as in something that was born, carried, entangled in the fur of Maud, a gigantic, flying, despotic bear created by the profoundly corrupt and nefarious company, a downfallen biotech firm that was largely responsible for the destruction of the city and where Wick used to work. Without really understanding why at first, and despite Wick's reservations then outright objections, Rachel decides to keep Borne. She quickly realizes that it is much more than first appeared, and a relationship progressively develops between them. This bond and the mystery surrounding Borne's nature or identity and its relationship to the company form the heart of the story. Borne is written in first person from the sole point of view of its human main character, Rachel, and through what I essentially took to be journal entries of some sort, as each chapter is headed by a very descriptive title such as How I Found Borne and What This Meant for Me, or The Day Wick Finally Told Me About His Past, things like that. And that brought to mind the way one writes in a diary, or journal, or the way one may go about writing a memoir, actually. But your mileage will undoubtedly vary with this, as always. Said chapters tend to be on the shorter to medium side of things, giving the story a relatively even pacing that never felt too fast or too slow, really, despite the fact there are, yes, slow moments that allow for the development of Rachel's relationship with Borne and more introspective writing. Things ramp up a little bit towards the end of the story, but the transition this entailed felt entirely organic and earned to me. If pressed, I'd say the prose in Vandermeer's The Southern Reach, and especially Ambergris novels, feels more elaborate and skillful overall than it does in Borne. That being said, I actually really enjoy this prose, and I mean, ultimately, it's Vandermeer's prose, right? It's not going to be fundamentally different from one work to the other. So, as a story, Borne feels pretty intimate and displays a fair bit of introspection, like I said, and if you think about it, that ultimately also goes for The Southern Reach, in places at the very least, and Shriek and Afterwards specifically when it comes to the Ambergris books. And that wouldn't be possible without, well, a certain measure of evocative, not to say mildly haunting elegance, and an even greater one of emotional resonance in the prose. I wrote down quite a few quotes from Borne in my reading log, and was pleasantly reminded that, yeah, there's a freaking good reason why Vandermeer stands as one of my 3 favorite authors. Since this is weird science fiction, I'll also quickly add that there was, yes, a smidge of context-specific vocabulary that worked perfectly well within the text to flesh out its world and future setting. In fact, there's even a bestiary at the end of the book that I didn't really bother to peruse this time around, but which I certainly appreciated the first time I read it. I also enjoyed Borne's character work, all the more so given the fact I've, well, read and reread more of Vandermeer's work since 2018, and am thus now able to compare and contrast a lot of his writing, and notice patterns therein. I think it certainly holds its own compared to The Southern Reach, Hummingbird Salamander, and even Ambergris to a lesser extent. To a lesser extent because I think Shriek and Afterward is probably the most character-focused novel I've read written by Vandermeer. Still, Rachel, Wick, and yes, Borne even Maud, the giant flying bear, actually, all felt distinct and real enough to me. Rachel, most of all, of course, as the story is told from her point of view, and she spends a fair bit of time reflecting on Borne, her relationship with it, or him, with Wick, her living situation, the state of the world, and her past as well. And then there's Borne, the creature, and it, or he, felt believably strange, unhuman, mysterious. But it, he, was also really endearing. Borne is honestly pretty charming, even cute at times. Its relationship with Rachel, the love they come to share, that's the heart of Borne, the novel, and I loved it. I was also moved by Rachel's relationship with Wick. It's not an easy or straightforward relationship, but its delicate nuances were portrayed very believably and with a lot of compassion, for lack of a better word, and I really like that. The world of Borne broadly falls under the category of post-apocalyptic, or perhaps para-apocalyptic, with the apocalypse here being climatic and ecocidal in nature. Rachel grew up as a climate refugee, and it is very clear from her reminiscences and present account that humans have fucked the planet pretty thoroughly for themselves and most other species through climate change, pollution, and other such forms of environmental degradation. This has led to refugee crises and authoritarian captures of power, and whilst the story never goes into any real detail about this, it is, again, pretty clear that the general situation of the world at large is no bueno. And this is most definitely true of the ruined city Rachel and Wick inhabit. It seems it held out for a while longer than a lot of other places, largely due to the presence of the company and its promise of miraculous biotechnology, but ultimately, it is this exact same company that eventually speeded up the destruction of the city it supported, in no small part because of Maud, the giant flying bear it created, and then, more or less, accidentally, I guess, unleashed upon the city. It also just occurred to me that it's called The Company, just like The Company is called The Company in the video game Lethal Company, which I've played and enjoyed, and I mean, it does have somewhat similar themes. It maybe shares one theme in common, but so yes. Big bad company. You could also thus potentially make a case for this qualifying as biopunk fiction, since it focuses on characters trying to survive the destructive excesses of technocentric hubris and capitalist greed. But then I'd argue weird science fiction just kind of overlaps with biopunk in terms of aesthetic hallmarks by default in any case, and I wouldn't actually call Borne biopunk myself. See, to my mind, biopunk, like cyberpunk, needs a more overt, and dare I say rebellious, low-life versus high-tech, in this case biotech, through line that just isn't really present in Borne. I say this because I read an actual biopunk thriller earlier this year, right before Borne, titled Extremophile, and written by Ian Green, which I enjoyed, and the tone of it felt pretty different to that of the former, or something like the Southern Reach trilogy, a much more closely related work of fiction, and not just because it was written by the same author. Indeed, both the Southern Reach trilogy and Borne share an interest in biological transformation, adaptation, and the potentially shifting nature of identity in terms of theming, which I'll get back to shortly, and I don't know, for me there's an intimacy and quite thoughtfulness in both of these works, and other works of ideas-driven weird fiction I've enjoyed, that just makes them feel pretty distinct in terms of genre assignation. That being said, your mileage will vary here, and it probably won't even matter to any but the biggest classification nerds, like myself. Just like that of the Southern Reach, or the books of Ambergris, I found Borne's world very immersive, but I do want to stress that it's not necessarily the most plausible or elaborated upon in terms of actual science fiction, weird or not. I couldn't tell you how the company was able to transform a man into a giant flying bear, or how Wick was able to create drugs out of a big vat, it's a repurposed swimming pool, of primordial biochemical ooze tucked away in a derelict apartment building. Nor will you ever fully understand just what the fuck Borne, the creature, actually is. You do have to suspend your disbelief and take it on faith that this is just somehow the available biotech of the future, to some extent. And yeah, it's completely fair to say some of it might as well be magic, again to a certain extent. Not that I would call this science fantasy either, mind you, given its aesthetic conventions and thematic focus, but yes, it definitely fits right into weird fiction's baked-in tendency to blur genre lines. Absolutely. At the end of the day, the point of Borne's world-building isn't watertight plausibility, but rather thoughtful contemplation of cause and consequence and strong emotional resonance. Like I said, there are strong thematic parallels between Borne and the Southern Reach trilogy, just as there are thematic parallels between Borne and Hummingbird Salamander, and even between Borne and, well, Shriek and Afterwards specifically, to a certain extent at least. These parallels are chiefly concerned with environmentalism on the one hand and identity on the other. So first, environmentalism, and that's the big one with Jeff Vandermeer's fiction, right? It's very present in The Southern Reach. It's borderline too present in Hummingbird Salamander, though I still liked it. It's present in Venice Underground too, almost forgot about that one, and it is most certainly present in Borne. Rachel grew up as a climate refugee, like I said. Humans as a whole have fucked up the natural world, and there are numerous descriptions of barren, or at the very least polluted, heavily polluted environments. But with this harsh, though ultimately fair, judgment of human greed, imbalance, and destructiveness, also comes a hopeful discussion of the ability of organisms to change, adapt, and survive. Of the ability of life to find a way, basically. Borne, the creature, stands as a prime example of this, as he's an almost infinitely changeable creature. But other creatures, such as what I like to call the story's preternatural foxes, illustrate the beautiful plasticity of life as well. Now, whether humans manage to change, adapt, and survive along other forms of life remains an open question, but I'd argue the book ultimately puts forward a cautiously optimistic view of things. Which, yes, also kind of goes for The Southern Reach, actually, and Hummingbird Salamander, though I'd contend it feels strongest in Borne. Then there is identity and the impact of transformation, whether physical, experiential, or emotional, on identity, a theme this book shares with The Southern Reach, once again, and then pretty strongly with Shriek and Afterwards specifically. Several characters in the story go through lesser or greater kinds of transformation. The biggest example of this is obviously Maud, who used to be human, but is now, by the time of the story, a giant flying bear. And Rachel often wonders if Maud remembers being a man, to what extent the Ursine has superseded the human. There are preternatural foxes, like I said, that seem to be in the process of transforming from one thing to another, or to have undergone a certain amount of transformation, and display uncanny levels of intelligent awareness. Are they really foxes, then, or are they something else? And that's without going into a whole other discussion about the inherent sentience of non-human animals, but anywho. Then there's Rachel and Wick. Both experience very difficult but psychologically and emotionally transformative events, simply by trying to survive in the very harsh environment of their ruined city, but also by interacting with Borne and one another. This is where memory and its loss also comes in as a transformative mediator of identity. Rachel doesn't actually remember how she first came to the city, but she certainly remembers her childhood and being a climate refugee, desperately trying to find a new home with her parents. Also, as a little FYI, I do love that Wick had loving parents. I feel like sometimes fiction overemphasizes dysfunctional families, so it's always a nice change when characters who used to be children, obviously, just had loving families, parents, etc. Anyway, Wick, for his part, carries secrets within him that, well, haunt him to the point of substance abuse. Both have been shaped by adversity, traumatic memories, and yeah, the loss of time, in a way. Finally, there is Borne, our creature extraordinaire, through which the story explores what it means to be human. Or rather, what it means to be a person, regardless of species, and what it means to have an individual identity shaped by experience, memory, but also empathy and love. And that brings me to the last theme I want to talk about: the transformative impact of love and relationships on identity. I'll concede it sounds a bit corny, perhaps, and it's definitely a more diffuse, secondary theme of the book, but it really spoke to me this time around, because at the end of the day, the heart of Borne, the novel, lies with Borne, the creature, and Rachel's relationship, and even the latter's relationship with Wick, to a slightly lesser extent. The care and tenderness Rachel shows Borne very obviously leaves a lasting impact on his developing psyche, sense of self, and informs the ensuing inner conflict he experiences regarding his personhood and sense of goodness, and I'll leave it at that. The depth of character given to both Rachel and Borne, and the more or less parental filial love that binds them, goes a long way to make the novel as emotionally impactful as it is. And then there's Rachel and Wick's relationship, and the fundamental truth that, however difficult their bond may feel to maintain at times, they are better and certainly stronger together than apart, especially given the crumbling world they inhabit, because they have grown together and shaped each other through adversity and tender familiarity. Borne is a deeply melancholic story, but what I love about it is that it is also ultimately beautifully balanced with persevering hope, warmth, and compassion. Not, again, entirely unlike The Southern Reach at the end of the day, although it is also different and doing its own thing, obviously. And then there's just nothing for it. I found Borne, the creature, honestly adorable. I mean, he is kind of terrifying too at times, but I won't say more for spoilers. And I found his relationship with Rachel so freaking endearing. But then I also loved her relationship with Wick. It felt so real and moving. There is something truly poignant about Borne. It is quietly but unashamedly thoughtful and full of heart at the same time, which is why I gave it a very strong 8.5 out of 10 rating upon reread. Might have been a higher rating than the first time I read it, actually. Also, as a quick little addendum, I have read the accompanying novella, The Strange Bird. It's quietly thoughtful, elegant, and moving as a little complimentary story. I have also read Dead Astronauts, which technically fits into the Borneverse. I did not like that. That was infinitely too experimental for my tastes. I wouldn't bother with it personally if you're interested in reading these. Just stick to Borne and then maybe The Strange Bird. That's my recommendation. The Southern Reach remains my favorite work written by Jeff Vandermeer, and my favorite science fiction series of all time, like I already said, because he's just such a perfect little gem. But now I definitely think Borne comes in second, just ahead of Shriek and Afterward, because that one is also just very good, and I have reviews for all of those as well, by the way, if you're interested. And that concludes my review of Borne, written by Jeff Vandermeer, an absolutely great reread and a great way to more or less open 2025 reading-wise. I hope you found this review entertaining, engaging, informative, interesting, all those good things, and on that very final note, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all at some point in another video, but until then, bye-bye!